Welcome to Hawksong Weaving. I'm a disabled weaver who works exclusively with thrifted and secondhand yarn, and today I'll be weaving a smoky blue shawl from a thrifted wool blend yarn. I hope you enjoy. Life takes odd turns, but even tattered and worn yarn still has value. Tired joints and health flares don't have to stop the journey. Welcome to Hawksong Weaving, where all our paths are a little bit warped. All of the yarn I'm using in this project are a variety of wool blends that I thrifted from the Goodwill thrift store in my town. I shifted the design of this shawl a few times in relation to how much yarn I had remaining from this batch, and that's part of what I love about working with thrift store yarn. Pretty much everyone is struggling right now, so reminding myself that I can adapt and make do temporarily relieves some of that economic existential horror. If you're curious about the adaptive warping method I'm using, feel free to check out the link in the corner. I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and with that comes a lot of joint hypermobility and chronic pain, so this is the warping method I've adapted to suit my needs. Off topic, how has everyone's spring been going? I'm really excited. I had a consultation with a local gardening company, and I'm getting a native pollinator, wildflower, and herbal garden put in. My landlords gave me permission, but I bit off more than I could chew with my limited mobility and energy levels. So within the next month or so, I'll be getting flowers. I'm lifting up the loom to release the warping board from the loom, gathering the warp threads into one large bundle and using the back of my neck to drape them over and keep them tidy and out of the way, while I collapse the warping board and get it tucked out of the way until I'm at a full pause point where I can get it unclamped from my desk and put away. I use terry cloth towels to cushion the warp threads. This helps prevent the finished weaving from being tighter at the ends and looser in the middle, creating a sort of sausage profile in the weaving. This method won't be everyone's cup of tea, and that's okay. Like everything about how I create content, take what works and leave the rest. The way I warp has me cutting the warp loops at the end of winding the warp. This is what's easiest on my body. And again, it won't work for everyone, and that's okay. This isn't a great angle, but I'm being careful to pay attention to how the warp threads are laying at the back bar of the loom, and the right hand thread goes through the smaller hole in the rigid heddle reed. It's not critical, and some minor mistakes aren't the end of the world, but it does make it easier to keep the tension of the warp threads even across the entire weaving. Hades' himbo was being very sweet the entire time. At some point I'll be putting out a bonus video of him being cuddly and getting cuddles during this rigid heddle of threading. He's so respectful of the lady cats. The smaller tabby in the frame is my partner's cat. Her name is Belith, and she's at this bratty stage of, if Hades has it, she wants it, hence her taking up his usual napping spot. Before I get too far into this, I'd like to thank you for watching. If you'd like to support my work, some free ways to do that are to like, subscribe or follow, and share. This applies to other small artists as well. It's a great way to let the social media algorithms know that this is content worth watching. If you'd like to support me financially, per viewer request, there's a Buy Me a Coffee linked below, along with the link to the Hawksong Weaving Square site where you can purchase unique woven products. I also now have a Patreon that's also linked below. There are currently 4 legit tiers and 1 very silly tier. These tiers include early access to videos, a weekly post of Life of the HR and OSHA Cats, a Kvetchy diary, being able to vote on projects, a first dib groups for projects featured in videos, and fun snail mail. The 5th tier is absolutely a joke, but just in case, in this economy, I won't say no. For $1,000 a month, you can tell me that I'm not actually disabled, I'm just lazy, and to try whatever yoga, juice cleanse, snake oil nonsense fixed your cousin. I'm absolutely open to other ideas for Patreon, please feel free to comment them. Attaching the warp to the bottom apron bar is pretty easy. I finger comb it, get it separated into bits about 4 to 5 warp threads wide, separate these bits into 2, and then do a half hitch tie to the apron bar. This yarn is so soft, and even at this point in the weaving, I can tell that it's going to drape beautifully. Because it's a softer, more delicate wool blend, and the weft is lighter than the warp, I'm being careful not to pack it down, but rather to keep space between the weft passes. The steam blocking later on will help these fibers come together, but right now they need some space. Again, it's so incredibly soft. Weaving this was exactly what the doctor ordered. I'd been having a tough week for interpersonal reasons, and being able to focus on this just really helped. Does anyone else do that? Where, you know that you're going through a hard time, and you deliberately use the soft, nice, gentle yarns? And it's like self-care, but with weaving. When weaving one of these shawls or stoles, whatever you want to call them, because I have a smaller loom, I weave them in 2 or 3 panels, depending on how much yarn I have. With this particular shawl, like I mentioned earlier, because of the amount of yarn I had in each color, I ended up changing my plans for it a couple times. After warping and weaving the second panel, I could tell that I wasn't going to have enough of the gray yarn for another full warp, so I gambled a bit in weaving the third panel. From weaving the more delicate weft, I knew that it had some weak points, and I wasn't sure how it was going to handle steam blocking, so I took a risk using it as a warp. If this as a warp didn't work for a panel for this shawl, due to the lighter yarn, my plan was to separate it and, depending on how it steam blocked, either use it as a scarf or use it in other products. In the last video on making a shawl, people asked how I made sure the panels weren't the same length, and the short answer is I wing it. The longer answer is, due to my hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I'm effectively dyslexic. Essentially, my eyes are hypermobile, and that causes problems with reading, especially with numbers. Math is incredibly difficult for me because the numbers jump around and don't follow patterns like words do. I can pattern recognize words when I'm having a hard time with my eyes not cooperating, but numbers don't have the same pattern for the math that I'd be doing for weaving. So I guesstimate, and I keep track of how much spring the yarn has and use my loom as a measuring tool. And I'm careful to only use wool blends that will steam block more effectively for larger projects like this. If I was doing this with only acrylic, I'd need to spend more time ramming my brain and eyes against my disabilities, and I'd much rather spend my time and energy on actually weaving. When tying off the panels, I prefer to do a 2x2 tied into a fringe of 4, but if I'm short on warp threads, I'll do a double sliding knot of 3. And no, you're not imagining it, I am jumping around with the different panels for showing the different steps, again, because this is a larger project. You're not crazy, the warp did change a couple different times. Before I sew the panels together, I steam block each of them. This allows the wool fibers to soften into each other and relax into the weave. Without blocking, you can get wrinkles because the weave tends to be stiff without added heat and water. Sort of how your back gets when you've been sitting in a not great position for too long and a boiling hot shower takes care of the knots. Because this is a wool acrylic blend, I have my iron set to wool blends, and even with that I'm being careful not to rest the iron on one spot for too long. It's hard to tell with the camera angle, but mostly I'm just skimming the surface of the panel, letting the steam do most of the work as opposed to deep pressure and direct heat. My cheap Walmart iron is getting on in years, so I'm having to shake it a little bit on this lower setting to make sure that the steam actually comes out. It's a bit frustrating, but eventually it gets the hang of things. Once all 3 panels are steam blocked, I move everything I need to my kitchen table. For the sewing, I use the remaining ends of the gray yarn that I used for most of the warp. The lighter yarn had weak points that I got lucky with during the warping of that particular panel, but I knew better than to try to use it as sewing yarn. To avoid loose ends, I weave the sewing yarn into the actual fabric. I'll tie a knot at the very end of it, but I find that weaving in the loose ends helps keep things tidy. I started fiber arts with knitting, so this was a fairly easy step for me to take. The way that I sew these panels together that I found works best is to hook the needle through the weft loop of the selvage, or the edge of the panel, and the outermost warp thread at the same time, and do a whip stitch, essentially jumping diagonally from each panel all the way up. This does cause the seam to be somewhat raised, which is why, yep, you guessed it, more steam blocking once the sewing is done. Because I don't measure these exactly, there are a few points where I tighten one side of the blank and know that I'll steam block out those wrinkles down the line. Again, this is why I make sure to use wool or wool blend yarn for these larger projects. This isn't going to work for everyone, and again, that's okay. Take what works and leave the rest. And just like at the beginning of sewing these panels together, I'll weave the sewing yarn into the weave of the panels. This also helps prevent unraveling down the line. Penelope Calico and Hades Himbo joined me for part of the stitching. I'm so glad for them. They're both in various bits of paperwork as emotional support animals, or ESAs. This is different from a service animal because they're not trained to provide service in any way. They provide emotional comfort and support by being with me. At darker times of my life, knowing they were there has kept me on this planet. Both Hades Himbo and Penelope Calico help by providing pressure, companionship, and tactile comfort. Penelope Calico has added being a heart rate monitor for my postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome to her role, but she wasn't trained for that. She's just deeply opinionated and more than willing to scream her complaints to me. I adore her and I'm grateful for her, but I'm never getting another Calico, ever. Think tortitude and orange stubbornness all in one cat. Because of how I was raised and my background, I also use my cats as a cheat code to judge other people. I make very clear boundaries around how my cats are to be treated by people who come into my home, and if those boundaries aren't respected, I know that that person is unlikely to respect any of my own boundaries. The boundaries are pretty simple. The cats don't owe you anything. Don't feel entitled to their space. And if they come up to you asking for pets, that is their choice. If you don't want to pet them, you can ask me politely to remove them from your space. Watching how people treat animals can usually be a very good judge of their character. Now for the final steam blocking. This is important especially for those tightened bits from my measuring methods. They'll all smooth out. Because this is a wool acrylic blend, I'm still being really careful to keep my iron on a lower setting and not provide direct pressure with the iron. It would suck to be at the final steam blocking and melt this shawl. Now that the ironing is finished, I eyeball the length of fringe that I want and use the "don't ask me how much I spent on these good shears, and trim it. The final step is a few more hours of tying knots. I ended up needing to take a break during this because it was humid and my fingers were being a bit too hypermobile, but I prevailed and got it done. Thank you for coming along as I wove and sewed a smoky blue shawl. I'm so glad for the odd turn that your path took that brought you here. Thank you for spending time with me at Hawksong Weaving, where we're all a bit warped, and I hope you have a truly excellent week.